Then we've got, I don't know if you all know about, and we'll talk about it at length probably today, our electoral college system, which is a very complicated system of election. But American presidents are not elected by popular vote. The person, whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, who gets the most votes might not necessarily win. And this has put an enormous amount of power in this particular election in 7, what we call swing states that can go either way. So these states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, suddenly their voters have enormous power. So we're saying a few 100,000 or 500,000 voters have an enormous amount of power. So you've got millions of people voting, but it's actually very few people whose vote is going to count and make the difference in this election. And this has caused something very strange, or maybe it's actually normal for a US election, which is the candidates are focusing in on what matters to those voters. Now, we have 2 big, messy, ugly wars going on right now in Ukraine and in the Mideast. And nobody's really talking about that because the voters in Pennsylvania maybe care more about owning a gun, or more about the migrants that have moved into their neighborhood, or more about someone needing an abortion. So abortion, migration, the economy have become dominant issues. And these huge, important questions that are so important for the entire world, what the US is going to do about the war in the Middle East and what the US is going to do about the war in Ukraine, are almost being ignored. So we're at a really crucial moment, and we have 3 people who are going to be very interesting. Let me just say a little bit about our 3 speakers today that I have their bios here. Roberto Menotti here is editor-in-chief of Aspenia Online, deputy editor of Aspenia, senior advisor of international activities at the Aspen Institute in Italy, in Rome. He is a member of the scientific board of the NATO Defense College, and on the advisory council of the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs at John Cabot University. Andrew Spanos is a colleague of mine, a journalist and political commentator, and he's done a lot of first of all, you'll see him all the time on TV. He's excellent. And he has a podcast that's called That's America, is a regular commentator for Radio 24, Rai News 24, and other print publications. He wrote a book on political transformation in the United States and Europe in recent years, of several, but one called Perché vince Trump in 2016, and has just come out with Rivincita, l'enigma americano spiegato agli europei. Then we have Germano Dottori, our defense expert over here. He's a scientific advisor to Limes, the Italian Review of Geopolitics. And he's, since June 2021, he's been a member of MedOr Foundation and Board of Directors. He's a parliamentary advisor in foreign and defense policy since 1996. He's a lecturer in strategic studies at Lewis and advisor to an undersecretary of defense, among many other things. Formally. Anyway, I'm going to let them each speak just a little bit to start, and I've sort of divided up their compiti, their homework. They don't know this yet, but I'm going to let Roberto, and I think because we're Americans, or I'm American anyway, and we're at the Centro Studi Americani, and you guys are all young, I'm just going to use first names today. In Italy, we often use the lei and dottore, and if I was going to be polite, it would be Dottor Minotti, Dottor Spanhaus, Dottor Germano, but I'm going to stick with first names. So we're going to start with Roberto first to talk about institutions and whether the institutions in the United States, our Supreme Court, our Congress, the White House, the press, how they can protect our democracy that is indeed fragile. And I'll just say after that, because I'm going to split this up I'm going to ask Andrew to talk to us about the economics. That's one of the important themes of this election that I didn't really get into, and somehow how that can affect polarization of a lot of issues. And then finally, I did mention the wars. Defense is, Germano will talk about defense. It's such a huge issue, but yet not very much mentioned. The arms business also in the United States is a huge business. So passing the floor first to Roberto. Oh, and then we'll have a discussion.
No, maybe that's my fault. Is it on? Yeah, that's my fault. So hello, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, and glad to be here, especially with two friends and colleagues whom I know very, very well. I would start from a general, let's say, statement, and I will use a few quotes to help us, navigate the question of institutions and individuals, because I would stress this from the beginning, that institutions are something that we use, that we create every single day, right? I mean, this is a building, but this is not technically, certainly not a government institution. But if you think about Palazzo Chigi, as we call the physical building of the executive in this country, that name doesn't refer to the building only. It refers to a concept. It's the place where the government will meet. Every decision, every key decision tends to be made there, right? Like the White House, like Congress. The physical place becomes a concept. So, in that sense, institutions may be seen as a metaphor, but at the same time, it's an important metaphor, because unless we believe in institutions, they don't really exist, right? I mean, the president at some point, of course, becomes an individual, a physical person with personality, skills, a personal history, and so on. But these things are always connected. So I think, number one, let's think of institutions as a combination of ideas, individuals playing that role for a period of time, and public opinion believing that they actually exist. Because without that sense of trust and belief, this is all fake, and it's very fragile. So it's based on the idea that we all believe in the same basic rules. Let me start with one quote then. Joe Biden, in his inauguration speech 4 years ago, approximately, January 2021, he actually exclaimed at some point, democracy has prevailed. So he was arguing that democracy had been under threat, and then he, together with the American people, essentially his voters, had saved democracy. It's a pretty big statement. It's pretty serious stuff, especially because this is what was after the election, during the inauguration. So at a time when apparently you might say the moment of threat had passed, but still he wanted to emphasize and highlight exactly that point, which is the same point we hear every single day from Kamala Harris and generally most of the Democrats. One problem I see with the institutions of a liberal democracy, not just the United States, but any liberal market democracy, I would add, which is what we have in common as let's say, contemporary democracies, is that there is no end game. So when Joe Biden made that statement and declared, that specific period of danger is over because I saved democracy. Of course, again, I and the American people, we saved democracy from that threat. Well, nothing is really over. Something starts all over again because he's in charge. He's the president. He's the chief of the executive. He has responsibilities and he will make mistakes. In fact, he did, right? Like everybody else would make mistakes. So democracy has this strange nature that it goes through cycles, ups and downs, periods when everybody's interested in, for example, the US elections, then we'll all forget a week after that. Then we'll remember again when a big decision is made by the new president. But that's normal, that there will be cycles because we have our own private lives. We're not constantly thinking of our institutions, right? We think about them when something needs to happen, like paying taxes or not paying taxes, or making some taking some big decision on war and peace, or on, I don't know, the fate of abortion, or whatever. So these cycles are normal, but that creates a problem for democracies, I think, because to keep the public opinion in general, or even part of the public interested and actively involved, is extremely hard for our political leaders, because we tend to quickly move back to our, let's say, daily life and our daily habits. One other, this is not a quote, but there's many authors in the past who have made this point, is to think about the institutions of the United States, again, as a contemporary liberal market democracy, that they don't really offer, let's say, they don't promise solutions. They offer ideas, projects, programs, plans. They experiment with solutions, but there's no reason why a democratic system should be better than any other at doing practical things, right? The thing is, in essence, a democratic system is one in which the institutions are more free to experiment. But that happens to some extent by trial and error. And we, the citizens, are those who sometimes pay for those mistakes, made by the people we elected, okay, or by the people we recognize as our legitimate leaders. But there's another issue there, right? I mean, there's a fine balance. I'm very happy that my institutions are more free, and I even believe more effective than those of authoritarian systems, but there's a price to pay. Again, the political cycles, the ups and downs. Like I kick, the last government out because I think they made too many mistakes. So let's say democracy is unstable. So the institutions that we're thinking about are unstable. So that gets me to a point that's much more specific to the US today. I think I'm one of those who believe, I'm among those who believe that Donald Trump actually makes a difference, that a lot of this is about his own personality. I don't think there's continuity with the previous Republican Party. I think the new Republican Party is 90% different than what it was, let's say, 8 years ago. I think his own personality really makes a difference. And the reason is his own relationship with the institutions. It's not his policies. It's not his personal history. It's not his character. I think that's all secondary. And we all have our own opinions about that. I think it's the kind of position he has taken vis-a-vis all of the major institutions of government in the United States. You just mentioned, for example, the Supreme Court. It's not because he chose those judges, because that's a legitimate decision he had to make, like others before him. It's the way he made the decision, expecting, explicitly saying that the Supreme Court would move in a certain direction, which is not his job. It's a judge's job. And that's one example. There's many, many other examples. So I think we also have a specific issue with his own personality and how he has been interacting with political institutions in the United States, including, for example, the Fed, thinking about the economic side of things. He's essentially the first president in the history of the United States who said explicitly that he dislikes the fact that the Fed is independent. In other words, he didn't even pretend that he would respect the so-called autonomy of the Fed. And again, these may be, some people believe this is a matter of etiquette. Like, okay, these are just political conventions. These are not formal rules. Well, some of these are formal rules that I think he violated in the past, but that's not for me to say. There's been an impeachment too, and a number of trials underway. Not my job, so to say. But let me note that I think even the way you interpret your role in terms of your, let's say, conventional or unconventional behavior can make a difference over time, even to the style of this campaign. She's, I think, extremely nasty, more than it would have been. It's not only his fault, to be fair, but I think he contributed to the atmosphere. One other little quote that I forgot when I mentioned political engagement by citizens. Let me get to the quote in a moment. The point is, many observers believe that the weakening of trust in political institutions in US would lead to disengagement from politics, right? This is an old argument. Like, you don't trust institutions, you disregard your voting rights, you essentially don't vote, right? It's interesting to note that in 2020, the opposite happened. Turnout was high, comparatively, historically pretty high. And that was extremely controversial in terms of polarization and all the rest that Andrew and perhaps Germano will talk about. So I don't see that connection necessarily. And I think people will be pretty engaged this time as well. We don't know, but Georgia, for example, if that's a signal, it seems like turnout could be pretty high. But in any case, I think it doesn't, I don't see that link necessarily holding. And there's this wonderful quote from, this is pretty old because this comes from Thucydides, Pericles, ancient Athens, but I love it because you'll find echoes of this in literature much more recent than Pericles. And the quote is more or less in the English translation from classical Greek. Just because you do not take an interest in politics does not mean that politics won't take an interest in you, right? Which others have used in slightly different ways, about war, for example. What I think it means in this case, if you apply this logic to the current electoral season in the United States, is when something impacts your daily life, you will become active, right? When it touches your nerves, you'll become active. For example, one tactical mistake made by Donald Trump, this has nothing to do with judgment, it's a mistake he made, I think, in tactical terms, was the abortion issue. In fact, he clearly realizes it was a mistake. It was a big mistake. He's all over the place on that issue because he made a mistake. You might say something similar happened in a different way to Kamala Harris when she was younger, about the police and perhaps, well, not really the death penalty, but let's say the issue of criminal justice. I mean, this is human to make mistakes and perhaps even change your mind. But when, you know, individuals become involved, is because something immediately, all of a sudden, becomes interesting. And you're right, I think I agree with you, Trisha. I don't think foreign policy will be decisive, but to some minorities it is. So it may, well, not just you, but some of the people in Michigan, for example, and elsewhere. This might be tiny little numbers, but who knows? And it's a tight race, exactly. Exactly. So it might make a difference. Yeah, and we will not know until the end whether it made a difference, but it may actually, I agree. One last point I'd like to make on, not really on institutions, but let's say on institutional setup. I think there's too much emphasis, as far as I can tell, on the problems of the electoral system in the United States. Let me explain. I think it's a messy system. It's a late, you know, it comes from 2 centuries ago. So it's an old system. It's perhaps needs to be changed, who knows? But I've seen exactly the same discussion and conversation over and over again in this country. Like, we have the wrong electoral system. Let's change the electoral law, which we did a number of times. And we're never satisfied because it depends on whether you win or lose. I mean, let's be fair. There is no good or bad electoral system. They're all messy and confusing. And the more you try to make them complicated to, let's say, to meet certain concerns or address some concerns, I think the more you mess them up. So what I'm saying is, yes, I see a number of problems with the way, not so much with the electoral system, by the way, but with the way, for example, that these things are counted. I think that's really ancient stuff. But okay, you'll tell us more about that. I would be horrified if I were American, but that's a very technical side of things. I think in general, we shouldn't overestimate that. Let me give you one example, which has nothing to do with the US, and then I'll stop, which has to do with the EU. There's an endless debate about unanimity voting or majority voting within the EU Council, right? I mean, we all know this is a big machinery. This is a big institutional mess. And of course, you have the complication of having individual governments and then the commission. And so everybody says, many people say, it would be so much easier if we only had majority voting. So you wouldn't have one country, not to be specific, Hungary, or Cyprus and Greece, constantly blocking decisions on specific issues because they're fixated on something, and they, make it impossible for us all to make decisions. I think it doesn't work that way. I mean, if we want to isolate Hungary, we do it in 2 hours, right? We invent something smart and creative, and Hungary doesn't matter at all. Let's make a little thought experiment. Imagine within the EU, you have majority system voting tomorrow, okay? Germany is against something that it cares a lot about, okay? It cannot block the vote because it's majority voting. Now, do you not think that Germany would be willing and able to create a blocking minority pretty easily, like 2/3? They would do it in 2 seconds. There's no problem, because the big countries will always block the decisions by the majority, if need be. So I think we really shouldn't, let's say, focus our attention specifically on the technicalities. Each system is weird. And I don't think the real question about the future of American democracy has to do with the Electoral College, with the federal system per se. There may be, issues here and there. I realize some of the states are vastly over-counted, right? Estimated. But that's by design. That's by design. And to some extent, we do the same with the regions within each country or the countries within the EU and so on. So I think that the key is let's say the general institutional setup. It's a federal system. It's a presidential system. Congress is very important, and the Supreme Court is very important as well, to oversimplify. The rest, I think, has to do with how individuals interpret their role within the institutional setup. And we'll see how the American people, what they will decide in, they're deciding already, right? They're voting already. Stop here, okay.
Thank you. Not sure if I agree with you on the whole electoral system, but we can discuss that later. I don't know, Andrew, would you like to go next and give us your viewpoints?
I would, thank you. I wasn't sending out posts on Instagram. I was writing my notes because I don't have paper. Although I did re-X something. Or do you re-X or retweet now? I don't know. Anyway, I'll start with just for 2 minutes. Sorry, since Roberto talked about it, the Electoral College, and you mentioned it. I think it's an important point, and I agree with much of what Roberto said. What I've been reminding people of recently, and they say, but you have this crazy system, you don't directly elect the president. I say, you don't directly elect your prime minister. Of course you don't. And remind people that this is from 1788, when this, as Tricia said, 1788. And what happened back then? There were no countries that directly elected their leaders at that time. When I said this on the radio the other day, some people said, what about Venice? Yeah, I said that was 100 noblemen, right? It's not a popular vote, okay? And so just the idea that people should vote, that everyone in the country should vote, was revolutionary. But there were many people who said, no, we want to keep the system that all the Europeans would keep until 1950 or so, that, you vote for a parliament and then the parliament chooses the leader. And that still happens. It still happens in Italy. It still happens in many countries. So you get things like Giuseppe Conte as the prime minister, someone who wasn't a candidate. You get things like the government falling and some other government coming in. It's a different system, and that's okay. It's not my place. I mean, it is my place. I'll comment on anything and judge anything, but that's fine. That's the European system. It's different. And in the U.S., the change is, it was a big change then to move towards a popular vote. And the shift, the distortion is pretty small. It exists and it's important. I think it's very important for the reasons that Tricia said about putting the focus on only some states. But the shift is small, and I think basically it's because each state has 2 senators. That's what's different, right? Because the House of Representatives is proportionate, so Idaho, has no people and California has tons of people. So Idaho has the same senators. That means that instead of having, the same number of electoral votes as their population, a proportionate number, they have two extra because they have two senators. That's the way the system works. So it gives this little thing. And surprise, surprise, today, at least in recent years, the advantage for Trump and the Republicans has been about 2 points, by the way. That's total Kabbalah, total coincidence, but in the Electoral College, meaning that Kamala Harris will have to win, most likely, although it depends on if the pollsters are right. They're making all sorts of adjustments by probably at least 2.5 points is the estimate of many people in order to win the whole election, in the popular vote, that is. But okay, that's that. But I want to get into the economic part. In 2016 for me was an exciting time, and Germano will remember this. And why? It was exciting. How old were you guys? You were kind of young. You weren't political back then. 2016 was very exciting, I think, because the debate changed. The political debate was different. I've been following politics was really bad, meaning that politicians lied a lot. They just didn't talk about the things that were really going on. Right? So there's these two. I want to talk about these two different levels. That is what you need to talk to people about, which Tricia mentioned at the beginning, and what's actually going on in institutions. Right? What the real policy is. So in the 2000 presidential election, the big debate was, what are we going to do with the budget surplus? The economy is so strong and so good. We have all this extra money. What are we going to do? 2000 was the height of the time when, the beginning of the height, let's say, because China was just about to come into the World Trade Organization. But that's when thousands of factories were moving to Mexico already, right? And you were in a situation where financial speculation, derivatives had become huge. They were now driving the economy. So the economy was based much more on finance and on high-level services. So part of the population was getting very rich off of this. Other people were getting poorer. There were people who lost their jobs from before, now were paid less, and they had to get 2 or 3 jobs. Right? And they were not able to participate in this huge new aspect of the economy. And so many people were very disaffected with politics. So 50% of people went to vote, by the way. 67% went to vote 4 years ago. Right? That's a lot, more than Italy, by the way. 66.7, I round up, okay? So there was a lot of talk, about economics in a way that did not reflect the reality, the transformations happening in the global economy. But people felt that. People felt these transformations. An important part of the population felt these transformations. So 2015 to 2016 was very important because we had not one, but 2 major candidates who came out and broke the rules. Right? They said globalization is bad for us. Global trade deals are bad for us. They're written by multinational corporations. They send jobs overseas. They have low labor standards, low environmental standards. These things are not good for our people and for our workers. Right? They both said, Trump and Bernie Sanders was the other one. So one on the right, one on the left. We need to change. We need to reform Wall Street. Right? So you had a debate which excited a lot of people. It excited me because I had for many years been writing about these problems and talking about them, saying that we were heading towards a disaster economically. So I do think that at a substantive level, what Donald Trump's policies are, or his instincts at least, are very important. It's very important. Then we'll talk about what politicians say to people. It's on 2 different levels. But at a substantive level, there's been a huge, huge change in the United States, and partially in Europe also. Europe is much slower to change than the US. The big change has been that now almost no one, at least let's say the people who make decisions on economic policy in the Biden administration, for example, almost no one believes in globalization and free markets the way they did before. They've changed their views because reality has forced them to change their views. 3 big factors have been key in this. One was political populism. That is, Trump, Sanders got a lot of votes. He got 43% against Hillary Clinton, who had the support of the whole establishment. That was big. Trump ended up winning the election because he got a lot more votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, talking to certain types of people who were disaffected with our institutions. It mixes in with cultural issues. We can get to that later. But so this forced the Democratic Party to change, and we saw it with Joe Biden. Joe Biden changed completely. In 2020, after the primaries, he said, I want to be like Franklin Roosevelt. And his policies were more in that direction than any president, I think, since Kennedy, in terms of state intervention, industrial policy. The Republican Party had a much harder time changing, and it didn't really change completely until this year. Why? Because they thought, well, Trump's going to be gone. We can survive without Trump. So the establishment of the Republican Party stayed with their old free market policies. Nikki Haley, you remember Nikki Haley, right? She was the alternative to Donald Trump. What did she talk about in the primaries? She started out with the problem of entitlements. So basically what she was saying, we're going to have to cut Social Security for younger people. What a great way to campaign, right? Let's tell people we're going to cut Social Security and cut Medicare. Surprisingly, people didn't vote for her. Oh, she also said, and Germano will pick up on this, she also said we have to fight all the bad dictators around the world too. People love that, right? The American people love that, right? Exactly. So the Republican Party didn't accept this change. Now, nationalism, we can call it economic nationalism, which has a very positive history in the United States of America. I teach a seminar about it. If you come to Milan, if you're done and you have to do graduate school at Azeri in Milan, you can sign up for my seminar, okay? Actually, it's mandatory. You don't have to sign up for it. So you have this change. Now the change is very clear, right? And I've heard people in the U.S. institutions talk about it. You can read their speeches by the National Security Advisor, by trade. The U.S. Trade Representative is very strong on these points. The head of the Federal Trade Commission. I mean, there's a very strong shift in the United States. So I think this is extremely important and very positive that this has happened. That is, that there is now an idea, and one of the keys is this sentence which the Biden administration uses, which is, it's not a great slogan, doesn't sound nearly as good as Make America Great Again, but it says we have to build a middle class. Our foreign policy is based on the middle class. Right? What does that mean? It means he's saying that we cannot be strong internationally if we've lost the solidity of our middle class and our industrial base. And so they're trying to rebuild that. It takes a long time, but the U.S. government has spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to do this. Sometimes it's efficient, sometimes it's not. I love to argue with economics professors about these things. I think it's necessary and important. But then there's the political aspect of it. What do we talk to people about? Well, the candidates go and they talk to people. They don't explain this huge shift. I mean, Biden tried to do it somewhat before, but you need to talk to people more directly. And so that means you say, we're going to give you money, for example, right? Everyone has a child. We give you $300 a month. That's what they did a few years ago. It was great. We used to get all these checks too during the she's smiling, $1,200, another check, $1,200, and then for children, so saying we're going to give you money to deal with things that are difficult because childcare costs a lot in the United States. So that's one aspect Harris did. And then she says, we're going to fight price gouging, inflation. Prices went way up in some areas, especially for food. So we're going to fight against the big companies that are making too much money, too many profits, and that's partially true. It's very hard to change, but people want to hear that. So that's what she does. And I thought, well, that's nice. It's good. You have to do that. They in Pennsylvania say we will not allow U.S. steel to be bought by a Japanese company, even though Japan is a strong ally. There's no strategic reason not to do it. But everyone now says, no, we won't let that happen. We're going to block that because that's a foreign country. We need U.S. ownership, American built, American made, American jobs. So what do you need to talk to people about? Kamala Harris, I was a bit disappointed in saying that she's been sort of superficial on this. And I can understand it because, again, what you talk to people about is things that are direct. But then she came out, and I'm coming towards the end. Then she came out and she said one day, she talked about Alexander Hamilton building a manufacturing base in the United States, Abraham Lincoln and the Transcontinental Railroad, John F. Kennedy and the Apollo program to go to space. I didn't see it in the Associated Press. I didn't see it in many newspapers. Almost no one talked about it. It's very, very, very useful to go read or the direct things that people write or hear what they say, because otherwise you have older generations telling you what you need to know, which is good. We're all really smart people, trust me. But there's often a lot of things there that don't get told. So she actually tried to talk about a really important tradition in United States history, which is linked to the economic shift today. I wish she would do it much more. It's hard to do. But so there's this, the idea I want to give you is this, there's this huge change that's gone on. And I was once called a communist because I talked about Franklin Roosevelt by an economics professor in Milan from the Bocconi. That was, the view was any type of state intervention is anachronistic, communist. You can hear that in Brussels still, but it's starting to change a little bit. It's going to take a while. But there's these two different levels, right? There's this huge shift going on, and then there's the popular debate. And people see prices went way up in 2020, 2021, inflation in the US, so they say the economy is not doing well. They trust Donald Trump more on the economy, which is a strange thing. Why do they do that? Well, because he was before the pandemic for the most part, and the problems showed up after him, right? And I think actually, as I told you, Biden has been probably the best president on US economics in a very, very long time. Just to close with an example of talking to people about important things. I have a podcast called That's America, as Tricia said. Yesterday, we published a podcast on Puff Daddy, on Diddy. Why do we talk about that? Well, because a 30-year-old told me, look, you need to talk about these things because that's what interests people. So I had to come up with, how am I going to use this to talk about something important about the structure of American society? So please listen to it and tell me if I did a good job.
Just to pick up quickly on what you were saying about Kamala Harris, I think I'm an American voter, and it just has been very frustrating, this not having gone through the whole primary process. She wasn't obliged to speak on a lot of subjects, and she is being extremely restrained or saying things that seem a bit bizarre. On Israel and the Palestinian conflict, more or less, she always says Israel has the right to defend itself, period. And so we don't really know what she thinks about that. And then another thing that I found almost absurd is that she went on the Oprah Winfrey show and said, oh, by the way, I have a gun, and if someone comes into my house, I'll shoot them, which I thought was I'm very anti-gun, being also a mother, and the idea that kids can go to school in the United States and risk their lives because someone can walk in with a gun and shoot up the school. It really upsets me. So I was bothered that the Democrats have tended to be slightly more gun control than Republicans. But to hear her say that really bothered me. So why was she saying that? And I think it was because she wanted to get, I don't know, the hunters in Pennsylvania or in Michigan or wherever, in Wisconsin. So we're talking about gun ownership, but we're not talking about the war in the Middle East. So now, or in Ukraine, or the long-range missiles that Zelensky would like. So I will pass the floor now to Germano to talk about defense issues.
Okay, good evening, everybody. And I would like also to comment something I heard so far. There is a lot of things Europeans and Italians don't understand about the electoral process in the United States. Problem is not in itself the way an electoral system based on two levels works actually. But in my opinion, there is a much more fundamental issue. Europe doesn't know anything about true federalism. If you could explain to the Europeans that there are so many penal codes into the United States, as many as the states are, maybe many people could be, how to say, troubled or surprised. But everybody should know that there are states in the US that applies the death penalty, while others doesn't apply. And that is a result of true federalism. And in Europe, even the Federal Republic of Germany under this point of view, is not so federalist as the US is. I would like also to tell that to us there are also other, to say, strange things. For instance, it's very difficult to explain to the Italians, and many don't believe it when they are told so, that in many states, electors are not asked to prove their identity with an identity card with photograph on. This is something that in a highly polarized environment like the one we have in the United States could be a recipe for disaster, because it's very easy in case of tight race that, and especially in a case where one of the candidates, or maybe even two, is not so available to recognize success and victory of the opponents, such a kind of electoral system, how to say, creates scope for demonstration, political unrest, and so forth. This is a weakness of the US democracy. Frankly speaking, when I had the first opportunity to read the subject of this conversation today, I was thinking about the eagle's fragility and strength, not in terms of virus and antivirus in the US democracy. To me, as a geopolitical analyst, fragility and strength relates to other issues. No? The factor of power a single country disposes of. And this is very, very, very important. What is going on in the US? Despite the perception of many in the public, in the US public, I think that the US is still the unrivaled superpower. The first and the most powerful superpower existing in this world. By every parameter. First of all, military might. If we consider, how to say, defense expenditure as a proxy of military might, you must consider that the US covers 40 to 45% of the world military expenditures in dollars. That means that the US spends more on defense than the 10 following countries in the list taken all together. This means that there is a military supremacy in every dimension of military power. Conventional, by sea, under the sea, in the sky, and on the ground, and even beyond the limit of atmosphere. Of course, rivals are taking countermeasures, but they are not really contesting the US supremacy. They are trying to find a way, how to say, to limit, to contain, and to bypass this reality of the US military might. Supremacy doesn't mean that the United States can do whatever it wants. No way. I was teaching last year to a couple of classes at the IES abroad. And one day we had a discussion about the posture and the role of the United States in this planet. And I asked my students how you see the future role of the United States in the world. The most surprising answer I got, but all the other confirmed, all the other attending confirmed, they shared the approach, was by a girl in her early 20s. And she said simply, Professor, you told us about our military might. And it's true by every parameter you quoted. But reality is, in our life, we are 20, in our life, we never saw the United States winning a war. This is another perception in the United States that is completely unknown to Europeans, but can explain the reason why so successful political actors are investing on this attitude, this new attitude of the American public opinion. My colleagues and friends, because we are all friends in our small community of people dealing with the United States and international politics, they told that foreign policy is not so important when people go to the polls and choose the president. I'm not so sure about that. And I have also a reading of what happened in the US politics since the end of the Cold War that, in my opinion, confirms my view. But I will spend some consideration in a couple of minutes about that. Really, and it's a comment about the institution. The President of the United States has no power in legislation almost, because there is Congress and there is the states. Where the United States President has the real power is in the realm of defense and foreign policy. Is there. So I don't know which consideration you take into account when you are going to the polls and express your vote. But actually, is the foreign policy they propose, the candidates, that should be the real factor you should weigh. Because on all the other issues, but the president, yes, can inspire, okay, but cannot decide. Cannot decide. This is the story. This is the story. And about the relevance of foreign policy, I can say also that almost continuously, with a notable exception of the second term of George W. Bush, the one who prevailed in the election was the candidate that was advocating for a less interventionist stance in world affairs. This is George Bush the Elder, who won the Cold War and the first war in the Gulf, had an outstanding record to show the public, okay? Incredible, right? But it was, how to say, an interventionist agenda he was advocating as a success of his mandate. And he found both Ross Perot and Bill Clinton that denied that it was foreign policy, the most important thing. Was true? Was
Stupid.
yes, exactly. But also, but also Ross Perot, no? Ross Perot was the first one to how to say, to criticize very, very hardly the policy aiming at creating a macroeconomic area, no? Open to free competition and damaging some part of the US production. It was in a way one of those politicians that anticipated Trumpism, not Trumpism. But in the end, what happened? Clinton won against Bush because the American public opinion was, how to say, already fatigued by the idea to lead the world. And that trend became structural, with just one notable exception that was provoked by 9/11. After 9/11, of course, America has been traumatized by jihadi terrorism and tried to react. But anyway, the failure, because it was a failure of the global war on terror, was what that brought into power Barack Obama, time and again, decreasing. And Obama defeated McCain. McCain was an interventionist and was defeated. And we see the same story. Andrew told you about the story of the Republican primaries, no? And the early defeat of Nikki Haley. Haley was the only one on the political arena that was openly advocating a neoconservative agenda to expand interventionism of the United States abroad. And she was off immediately immediately, because this is something that, how to say, in this very moment is not, how to say, doesn't pave the way to succeed. It's not an appealing political proposal. This is my point of view about. So, if should I say something about the fragility and the strength of the United States, I could say.
Just interrupt you there,
Yeah.
because then you're saying that Americans will vote for Trump because he's saying he's going to get us out of the war in Ukraine within, what do you say, 24 hours? So that's non-interventionist at that point.
What is very important is the very presence of Donald Trump made his opponents to adapt. Even Biden was forced to embrace a political agenda that was less and less interventionist. Let's be clear about that. Let's go back to January 2022. While the United States intelligence was rarely telling the whole world that Russia was preparing for invasion, what President Biden did, he chose to withdraw the American military advisors that were in Ukraine. If you think about the language spoken by the great powers in their relationships, mutual relationships, this is something like a green light. And Putin, for sure, read this decision by the United States, followed by a similar decision by the UK and Canada, as a sort of signal that the West was not happy about what was going to happen, but there won't be a war because of that. We could have adapted. And that is what it happened. So what I think, yes, even Biden, the one who defeated Trump, in a way, was forced by this trend to embrace a not interventionist approach. Look how difficult it is, even now, for the United States to announce that they are deploying the THAAD anti-missile system to Israel because Israel is running out of its own missiles for the Iron Dome. So it's, even if you are not maybe conscious about the relevance of foreign policy, really, you take into account unconsciously, and you are preferring since long those candidates advocating for a reduction of, how to say, the footprint of the United States in the world. What is interesting is that at our latitude, this is putting people into trouble because in a way we are recovering part of sovereignties, or at least we are asked to assume some responsibilities we were not used to. And I should admit, since I live inside the Italian political system, that most of the Italian politicians are scared about such a perspective. They are not used to think about their national interest. You see how much emotional reaction these days because what happened in the Middle East, without any kind of consideration of the relative strength of Italy vis-a-vis of Israel. You should check the socials, and you could read amazing things if they weren't horrible and absurd. So, just to sum up, the power of a nation, in my opinion, and the US is no exception, is a combination, results from a combination of material factors and immaterial factors. Material factors, the United States enjoys still an unrivaled supremacy, military, economic, informational, the best intelligence. the ability to shape the agenda, the global agenda on issues of its own concern. Where is the fragility, the vulnerability? Is in the stance of the public opinion that perceive a decline which is not real. There is no such a thing like the American decline. Maybe there is a rise of the rest. That's true. But America is not declining per se. And that's why, exactly like Reagan in 1980, Trump is exploiting this slogan, no? Make America great again. It's not a way we are weak, but it's just trying to address the problem that people feel weak, while they are not. While they're not. America is strong, very strong. Every time there is a problem, still, people turn the head toward the United States. Do something. Because when there is a big problem, we cannot fix it alone. This is the reality. You should be conscious about that, because when the United States fails to understand its role in the world, there is big instability all around, more wars, and in the end, also more intervention of the US abroad. Because to fix the problem, the biggest problem, you always need the American power. There is no other power able to fix, even if it's not so absolute a power. That's it.
Thank you. So I've been told we have a hard out at 6 o'clock, so we have to be out of here at 6 o'clock. So instead of just letting these three brilliant intellectuals chat among themselves, I want to take your questions because you're students and I'm sure you have a lot of them. So raise your hand, there's a young man, and stand up and tell us your question. Oh, I don't know if there's a separate microphone. Yeah, if you can take one and pass it and turn it on.
Okay. So my name is Federico Leofanti. I wanted to ask all three of you, what is the role of mainstream media in each of the arguments you've talked about? Because you've talked about three different aspects of both external and internal US politics. What is the role of mainstream media in the US? Because I know it represents a very different thing from what we know as mainstream media. What is the role of an institution inside the American system? Thank you.
Well, Andrew, why don't you start as a journalist? Since you're not asking me, since I work for the mainstream media, we'll let Andrew start with that.
I have never worked for the mainstream media, so I worked for fringe media once, a controversial magazine, which allowed me to learn about things and write things that were considered strange at the time, but which I think over time were shown to be different. I think so. I'm very sensitive to the question of mainstream media, and I think that there were a lot of problems with the way that the media responded to Donald Trump. Not only Donald Trump, but obviously he's the best example. I'll give you a great example from. I wrote this in my first book. HuffPost, back then it was Huffington Post, wrote at a certain point, we are not going to cover Donald Trump as politics anymore, but only as entertainment. This was during the election campaign at the beginning of 2016 or the end of 2015. How did that work out? There was a blind spot, a huge blind spot about what this meant. And it took a little while. After the election, there was some more realistic views of what had happened. But I think that there's still what happened afterwards is much of the media, not all of it, but much of the media accepted the idea that they had to be part of the resistance against what Trump represented. And in part, that's legitimate. You know, if Trump tells lies all the time, if Trump expresses things that are horrifying or against our Constitution, it's absolutely right to do that. The problem is that there was often a blind spot where you would not recognize where there was an exaggeration. You know, in Russiagate, the Russiagate scandals, I think, were a very good example, as there wasn't nearly enough questioning of the nature of those things, because there was no actual crime, and we found out, you know, later there was no crime there. There was a political thesis that Trump is an enemy to the country because he wants to be friends with Putin and give us up to Russia. Now, that's a political position, and so Trump was seen as the worst thing. Now, in everyone's defense, Trump has committed a lot of crimes, and he's, you know, would have been in jail if our justice system were a little bit faster, most likely, but that's not happened. So I think the other aspect is, I mean, I have tremendous respect for high quality journalism. This is very important. I've had a lot of debates on the question of information, and there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and social networks and the internet, you know, and my point is always that there needs to be a marketplace of ideas, that we do not need to censure people who say stupid things or wrong things. We need to, and in order for high quality information to survive, it just needs to do its job and do it very well. So I will read, like I think most of us here do, maybe Trisha, not for professional reasons, she's not allowed to, but read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal every day, because they do very, very good journalism. But they also can have blind spots, and they can have blind spots. So it's very important to also go and read publications which are really on different sides. I think it's very important to do that. And finally, to remember that this is a similar example of fact checking. Fact checking got to a point where we're going to fact check so much, we're not going to allow you to say things that we don't think are right. We have constitutions. Constitutions need to decide what people can and cannot say, and laws do too. I can say I can lie all I want in public, as long as I'm not threatening someone else. And the moment that the government starts to say you can't tell lies in public, we're going in a very bad direction. It's dangerous.
I just want to add that to that as a journalist with the mainstream media. When I was growing up, we had the newspaper that we read in the morning, and then the TV news that we watched at night, whether it was ABC, CBS, NBC, and I grew up in Boston, Boston Globe, New York Times, we read in the morning. And we trusted those journalists. Now, nobody necessarily trusted journalists. You guys are bombarded. You probably are getting all your news from X, from Instagram, from TikTok. Associated Press now asks me to go on TikTok. You know, I'm at the Trevi Fountain. I have to do a story on TikTok because we have to keep up with this. And it's so hard. And if we're covering, I don't know, the Bayesian sailboat of the entrepreneur, Mike Lynch from the UK goes down off of Sicily, and we're trying to report on this story, and there's somebody sending their video from the port, and someone, whatever, it just is a constant ambush or bombardment for all of the people receiving the news. And it's very hard. AP, our big motto is now fact-based journalism, and we're always trying to say we're the ones who you can find the facts with us. But there's a lot of competition out there. It was the good old days when I was young, when the journalists could, you know, sit back and have all the time they wanted to write their story because it was coming out the next morning, or the TV journalists had all the day to prepare their stories, and people believed in them because they weren't getting all sorts of information coming at them from other places. All right, next question. Anybody else? All right. There we go.
Hello, my name is Preslava, and I wanted to ask, looking back at history, also reading in the book of Henry Kissinger, Diplomacy, we know that America has a different approach toward foreign policy than Europe ever had, in the sense that Europe always believed in the equal power and distribution of power and everything, like balance of power. However, America had a bit of a slight different idea, believing that the ideals of America, the ideals of the founder fathers, should be in a way communicated with the other world, because they believed in the pure ideals that they had once writing and like creating the United States. So I was thinking, like, in your opinion, is America able right now in this global aspect return to the ideals that were back then, centuries ago? And like actually not only in their foreign policy, but also in the domestic one. Thank you. Domestic policy.
Well,
My general reaction when you were asking the question is to say that I honestly think Kissinger's analysis is badly outdated in the sense that he's been writing for a long time, by the way. So it would be normal. Not that I disagree with the historical analysis, but I think in current terms, if you look at, for example, the EU, because you made the distinction, he made the distinction between, say, the US and everybody else, but especially between the European tradition, he was thinking of that, you know, the balance of power, realpolitik and all that, and US essentially idealism. So it was thinking of one side of the US, let's say, debate. Well, in recent years, for example, the EU has moved very much to the other side of the debate. I mean, if we take seriously the rhetorical, let's say, the declaratory policy of the EU, to the extent that we have a foreign policy as the EU, which we don't, it's amazing. It's all about values. It's all about you know, being a standard bearer of something, be it the environment or human rights or whatever, and teaching lessons to others, essentially, which is pretty frustrating for the others. So I think that's changed a lot. And in the United States, as far as I can tell, there's been both sides at any given time. It's a constant back and forth. There's more than one school of thought in the US. So I wouldn't really agree with that general description, although I understand why Kissinger was making that argument, because he was counterbalancing a certain tendency that he hated. And he thought it would be a disaster if the other side had won that debate. But in general, on the domestic side, what is more, let's say, worrisome to us as outside observers of the US is the fact that, let's say, kind of debate, that polarization of the debate is now being played out in both foreign policy and domestic policy issues. In other words, that we see this country becoming more and more, I wouldn't even say polarized in some way, but sometimes fragmented, as if, you know, there's the market for ideas, let's say, is become pretty confusing to some extent. That to get a sense of where you belong, perhaps it's globalization that has made everything more complicated, even for the politicians, to address issues in a simple way, in a simplified way, perhaps has become impossible. And that complicates both the foreign policy dimension and the domestic side. So that maybe that makes domestic politics more interesting, but it's harder to describe in traditional terms, I would say. Just to end on this, for example, if you look at the traditional Republican Party, I still think it was, well, as opposed to a number of the things we're describing. So yeah, even the neocon were a tiny minority. We're a tiny minority, and they basically, that was like a hostile takeover of the party. They succeeded for a while, but it was a minority. In fact, they disappeared almost immediately when they made one mistake, pretty big one mistake. It was pretty big, but yeah.
All right, I'm just going to keep that because we only have 10, according to my watch, 10 minutes.
I would like just because I didn't tell anything about the first issue, but I would like to comment shortly about this question. Just to tell you one thing, it's beautiful to have a value-based foreign policy, but could be also risky, because in time of conflict, if you are pursuing values, you cannot compromise. While on the opposite, when a foreign policy is based on interests, you might find a compromise. So we should be aware of this trade-off. It's beautiful to foster values in the world, but values can be resisted more effectively, may be rejected, may be refused. And so it's so difficult in a negotiating process to reach a compromise and to fix a crisis on words. It's much better an approach based on interest, because you can give away something and take something else in exchange. But of course, I'm realist, and I like also Kissinger. I don't think he's any way outdated, but by the way, even Thucydides is not outdated at all, and he lived more than 2,000 years ago. It depends on what you write, not the time you live in. Just that.
That's a very interesting point, though. All right, let's keep moving.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Turijan Kwanov. I would like to ask a question about the development of Republican Party. H.W. Bush during the elections of 1988 said famous words, "Read my lips, no more taxes." That probably helped him to win the elections, but it became a problem for the next ones because in the end he had to increase the taxes because of the problem of budget deficit, and it was a very specific, unique moment when he was supported in Congress more by Democrats and less by the Republicans. But there's a point of view that this exact decision changed the Republican Party because after him, all the candidates of Republican Party became more radical in their ideology, more right, even though all the Democratic candidates remained almost the same in terms of their ideological views and policy. So my question is that, would you agree with that opinion? And if you agree, why do you think this tendency is still active, even though it's already 30 years past after this decision? Thank you.
That one is screaming Andrew Spanos.
I think there is a psychosis in US policy, as in European policy, about taxes and budgets, which is totally crazy. Yes, it comes from back then. That's a very good example. But there was very strong pressure put on by some groups. Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform. They became a very strong part of the Republican Party. It comes from the Reagan era too. Reagan had his saying, the worst words are, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." There was a very strong anti-government thing and anti-tax bent. And no one says they're going to raise taxes except for on billionaires. That was a big thing. The shift, just very briefly, the shift was, again, in 2015, 2016, of Bernie Sanders saying, we're going to expand Medicare. We're going to expand Social Security. No one had said anything like that because that means entitlements, government spending. And that was absolutely a race to the bottom in the political debate. I think it's very fortunate that since then, basically in the United States, this position has been almost totally marginalized, except for a small group of very strong conservatives in the House of Representatives who try to shut down the government when they can. One of them is a friend of mine from high school, Chip Roy. I tried to explain it to him. He didn't answer me. And what has happened is the U.S. government has realized that in the past few years, they can spend all the money we want because money doesn't come from Mars or from the West. We create money with the central bank. The question is how you spend your money. If you spend it for things that actually create wealth, then it works for the economy. If you just give it out to everybody and you don't produce things anymore, that creates inflation. So I think we're in a new situation, and fortunately, that problem is very minor now. It's huge still in the European Union, where the rules of all the treaties say you can't spend money, and Europe has no way to get over that so far.
I think we have one here right in the front row.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Maya Pandit. My question is for Mr. Dottori. Thank you for highlighting what you said about foreign policy and how there's this ideology in the US that the US has not, quote unquote, won a war. Do you think that recent actions of US foreign policy, specifically, asking US citizens to leave Lebanon, or their support, the US's support of Israel, both financially, ideologically, pretty much withstanding support, is to prove to domestically that the US can win a war, and that in some sense that they still have the US still has the same power?
The issue of the current war in the Middle East is a very complex one, okay? And I think that the role the US is playing at the moment is to supply weapons to Israel, and most recently to help Israel to defend itself from future possible new missiles from Iran or even from Lebanon, because they are running out, the Israelis. The reason why the US helps Israel, in my opinion, is closely linked to the very, I would like to say, intimate links between the two ruling elites. Between Israel and the United States, there is a special relationship. You may, in a way, change the tune from time to time, but you cannot imagine a situation where the United States and Israel decouple. I think it's not possible. What is interesting is this, that Trump in 2020 proposed a new strategy. And it was a strategy that reached important achievements. Problem is, what is happening now in the Middle East is the direct results of an attempt made by Iran and its proxies to derail the scheme of the Abraham Agreement. The problem is that, and it's sad to say that was not possible to the Biden administration to bring Saudi Arabia and Israel at the negotiating table to sign, let's say so, the mother of all Abraham Agreement, the one between the Court of Riyadh and Israel. And the failure is mainly caused by the refusal to consider the creation of a Palestinian state, because even Saudi Arabia needs to have something to show the public that they are taking care of the Palestinians, even if they are not interested so much in them, because this is also the reality. The Palestinian issue is a very sensitive one among the public opinions in the Arab and Muslim world, less among the elites, much less. So my prediction is that whoever wins in November, the United States will keep engaged in the Middle East, but of course with different plans, because if Trump wins, I think Trump will try to revamp his strategy and try at least to bring Riyadh and Jerusalem at the negotiating table to sign another Abraham Agreement.
But are you saying in answer to her question that it's not because the US has never won a war and they're doing it out of insecurity? It's more because of
No, the war is fought by Israel, not by the United States, and of course the enemies of Israel. I don't think there is a direct involvement of US troops on the front line to defend Israel. Could be also a serious failure by the Israelis. Something that the Israeli public opinion, I think, couldn't accept, because it's one of the tenets of the security policy of Israel to be able to stand alone for as much as possible, for as long as possible, because otherwise, how to say, the promise made to the Jewish worldwide that Israel is a safe haven to them collapses. And by the way, there is people living in Israel these days. I have friends that left, at least for this period. But you know, if Israel is not able to restore a dissuasion, there will be serious problem. Anyway, the fresh news is that Sinwar has been killed today. Just, yes, 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago. Sinwar has been killed. There are also the pictures of his body, in the web, you see. Just before I got here, yeah?
Pictures of his body. I missed.
Sorry.
Breaking news.
No, has been certified. The DNA has been confronted, and there is no doubt.
Where?
There is an official, in Gaza.
Well, so I
In Gaza. No, they brought to Israel, and they made all the how to say, the probes.
Okay, I'm being told that we have to wrap this up. I think we could go on all evening there. So we have to close down. I think I'm going to be back here on Monday for another event with, I don't know if it's going to be with you about journalism, but Sorry, maybe you can come up individually and ask these guests your questions, but thank you all for your attention. You guys have been a great audience.